In this presentation, you will learn about diversification of anthropology. With reference to the rise of anthropology, Harris states that the anthropology began as the science of history. As the scientific method became successful in the physical and organic domains, the 19th century anthropologists started believing in the discoverable laws or principles of socio-cultural phenomena. This interest, together with earlier aspiration of enlightenment and the vision of a universal history of mankind, was carried forward that resulted in significant contributions. However, with the 20th century, efforts were made to alter the strategic premises on which the scientism of anthropological theory was based. Almost simultaneously, there arose in England, France, Germany, and the United States schools of anthropology that in one way or another rejected the scientific mandate. Hence, it came to be widely believed that anthropology could never discover the origins of institutions or explain their causes. The diverse trajectories of anthropology subsuming fields such as ethnology and ethnography, as well as folklore, museum studies, and so on, have indeed been deeply marked by their national settings, that is, by different intellectual contexts, as well as different social and political environments. German scholars developed pioneering research agendas and coined numerous key terms in the 18th century, long before the forging of a unified German state. Here, as elsewhere in Europe, the anthropological field has been strongly marked by nationalism. Even where this legacy was later modified by the imposition of Soviet Marxist theories, the continuities remain substantial. Currently, anthropology has diversified and specialized in diverse fields such as politics, economics, ecological, psychological, amongst others. Its association with sociology is but obvious and hardly needs any explanation. With its diversification, anthropological subdivisions tend to concentrate on specific human living conditions and experiences. This specialization has helped anthropology gain focused understanding of human action and thought. As modern human culture as well as human behavior undergoes changes, anthropologists of diverse fields remain occupied in understanding and interpreting them. The ambition of anthropological thought to think humankind in its unicity and variation has historically placed anthropologists in the midst of cosmopolitan ideologies and utopias. It is difficult to know whether people are attracted to anthropology because they are cosmopolitan, or whether abstract notions such as culture, society, kinship, and humankind turn them cosmopolitan. In fact, going to faraway lands has played a central role in the discipline's constitution and consolidation, especially after ethnography in the first half of the 20th century became central tenets. Indeed, since the 19th century and more so in the past 3 decades, when the discipline increasingly globalized itself, anthropologists have woven innumerable transnational webs of scholarly exchange and influence. Anthropological cosmopolitanisms are sometimes set in motion, and anthropologists attempt to deploy their international agency. International conferences, for instance, are opportunities to connect with colleagues from countries and to set international agendas. Within the purview of British anthropology, Barth et al. State that this field arose on the fringes of a scholarly world that regarded other topics as far more important and interesting than the study of human social and cultural diversity. To the extent that curricula in the humanities looked beyond British topics, their focus was overwhelmingly on the Greco-Roman tradition as part of a conscious effort to make that tradition foundational to British thought and civilization. Inevitably, Britain's role in exploration, overseas trade, and colonial expansion during the 19th century led to a growing scholarly and public curiosity and interest in more global knowledge. From early days, British anthropology liked to present itself as a science which could be useful in colonial administration. In fact, with the rise of anthropology in Britain, we come across works of scholars such as Edward Tyler, Andrew Lang, Sir James George Fraser, Bronislaw Malinowski, and Claude Levi-Strauss, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, Raymond Firth, Edward Evans Pritchard, Max Gluckman, Edmund R. Leach, moving on to Victor Turner, and so on, all of which together have left a lasting mark on British anthropology. With this, one must add the effects of Marxism and feminism that have inspired anthropology in Britain to reach varied heights. However, with reference to colonialism, a strong internal criticism has come from the British cultural anthropologist Talal Asad, who talks about the unequal power interaction between the West and those that became its colonies, in the ways that anthropology was used to make the colonizers more powerful in their quest to conquer more and more places. Roughly between the 1780s and 1980s, the anthropological legacies from the German-speaking countries have been highly influential. Barth et al. Argue that there was a strong current of intellectual enlightenment in the German-speaking countries at first, both before and after the French Revolution. For political as much as for intellectual reasons, however, the Enlightenment legacy in German subsequently became confined to narrow limits. This nuanced general approach allows us to focus on the intellectual tension zone between Immanuel Kant and Johann Gottlieb Herder as one of the very first laboratory spheres for the formation of pre-academic modern anthropology. The work of the Forsters, that is, Father Johann Reinhold Forster and his son George Forster, usually is considered to be the outstanding empirical contribution from the German language zone to the travel report side of Enlightenment and anthropology. The overseas travel reports of Ida Pfeffer, the first woman writing in this genre, who wrote a few years later, also belong to the late Enlightenment period. And last but not the least, also belonging to the same Enlightenment genre, are the subsequent works of Alexander von Humboldt, who had traveled with George Forster along the Rhine, that is, his monumental 30-volume report on 5 years of travel in Southern and Central America, and his less-known travelogue on Russia and Siberia. The study of universal history was also of great importance in the German Enlightenment. Here, a new area of study came to the fore, Völkerkunde, or the science of peoples. In Germany, the philosophy of history divided into two branches. One studied the actual history of humankind and its diversity and customs in what could be called as a culture-conscious manner. The other branch was more interested in principles of history at the level of humanity instead of peoples, and worked with the concept of spirit instead of culture. Kroeber and Kluckhohn claim that the first of these branches resulted in a somewhat diffuse ethnographic interest, but in fact it produced a genuine Völkerkunde that was not diffuse but descriptive, historical, and universal. From the 1760s to the 1780s, various authors in the German-speaking countries and in Russia formulated, classified, and practiced a discipline called ethnographia or ethnography. These terms appeared as Neo-Greek synonyms of Volkskunde in the works of German historians working mainly at the University of Göttingen. The term ethnologia came later in the work of the Austrian scholar A.F. Kolar, followed by ethnology in the work of A.C. Chabanis. From the 1770s onwards, Volkerkunde, ethnography and ethnology grew into a discipline that developed in relation to history, geography, natural history, anthropology, linguistics and statistics. In 1781, the first issue of the 27-volume journal Betrage zur Volker und Landekunde appeared in Leipzig. In 1787, a young scholar-translator, E.F. Erman, published the first overview of aims and contexts of Volkerkunde in a popular magazine for women. No matter how critical one may consider the work of Marx and Engels today, a presentist approach to anthropology in German cannot deny the profound and profoundly ambivalent impact of Marx and Engels' work on our field in the decades subsequent to its completion. This ranged from the impact of their wider social theory to that of their narrower interests in core topics of anthropological concern. The effects of their work would later range from encouragement for the pursuit of critical research questions in new ways to quiet the opposite, namely legitimization of dictatorial state terror in the 20th century. For Bernard and Spencer, it is almost impossible to treat the anthropological traditions of Germany, Austria, and the German-speaking parts of Switzerland independently before the 1960s. To take a few examples, key figures in post-World War II Swiss anthropology were German or Austrian citizens. Most leading members of the former Vienna School were German priests, and R. Thornwald, perhaps the most prominent German anthropologist, was an Austrian by birth and academic education. However, as Barth et al. Presents a critical examination of the state of anthropology in Germany before World War I and asserts that classical evolutionism had been largely marginalized from academia, while historical diffusionism and social Darwinism were on the rise also academically. Folklore studies were about to become established as the historicist study of a superior Germanic self, set apart from the study of Herdenian Naturvölker. German language anthropologist research was still strongly embedded in the objectifying forum of the exoticizing museums of an empire that was an aggressive colonist newcomer. Moving to the moderate positivists, significant names include Max Schmidt, Theodor Koch-Grunberg, Karl von der Steen, Ernst Gross, Edward Hahn, Alois Musil, and Julius Lips. From a presentist perspective, the vast majority of socio-cultural anthropologists in Germany were more or less active supporters of the Nazi regime. Assessment of the practices and discourses of anthropologists in the Third Reich reveals profound parallels to other academic fields of that period, though with a number of qualifications and modifications. After 1945, financial constraints and political and intellectual factors were the main reasons why anthropology in these major parts of German language zone took an extremely long time to reorient itself. It took anthropologists of the German language zone 1 or 2 decades to fully understand how much the post-1945 world had changed for them in terms of language and status. Anthropology from the German-speaking countries came to occupy a relatively self-contained world of its own, less isolated, of course, than it had been during the war years, but still cut off from the international mainstream to a greater extent than, say, sociology or philosophy in Germany. The modern tradition of French anthropology, which dates from the beginning of this century, has always been stretched between the two poles of grand theory on the one hand and the minute and exacting study of data on the other. At the pole of specific data, French anthropology has been characterized by penetrating thoroughness of description, exhaustiveness, and craftsmanly care. At the theoretical pole, it has been centrally concerned with human societies as wholes, with a particular leaning towards the analysis of systems of social representations. A characterization of the French school before 1935 may be taken for the tradition as a whole. The French school maintained the primacy of the whole over the parts, the functional interdependence of the elements of a system, and the importance of establishing correlations among these elements. The central thrust of French anthropology has thus been quite distinct from that of both British and North American anthropology. Bernard and Spencer further also state a few characteristics of French anthropology that deserve particular mention. Firstly, France possesses a general intellectual culture which involves the educated public in a way unknown in Britain or North America. Secondly, much of French anthropology, particularly that which has been most influential outside France, has been theory-driven and field research. Thirdly, French scholarship takes place in a web of institutions, each with its own character, history, responsibilities, and centers of power that is unique in the world. However, Barth and al. Opine that France had no parallel to Britain's Bronislaw Malinowski in Britain, who at a key point in the development of his adopted national anthropological tradition invented enduring fieldwork methods, generated less enduring theories, at least partly on the basis of them, and taught anthropology through both. As far as teaching and inspiring fieldwork are concerned, the nearest parallels in France are the two Marcels, Mauss and Griol. As a colonial power, of course, France had its share of amateur ethnographers, administrators, missionaries, military officers, and the like. The 19th century was one of institutional foundation and consolidation. Until mid-century, new efforts were made to carry out an essentially philosophical agenda, incorporating the information coming in from around the globe. By mid-century, the philosophical agenda was being incorporated into a colonial one, requiring information that would be of use to administrators of empire. This shift is marked by that from the term ethnology, the study of specific languages and cultures, for the purpose of understanding humanity, to an anthropology general, an overall science that would include physical anthropology and human geography, along with culture and language. At the turn of the 20th century, Emile Durkheim and his collaborators created a comparative sociology that was to become the basis of modern French anthropology. The Durkheimian school was decimated by World War I. Marcel Mauss, the most important survivor, continued to promote sociology and particularly ethnology, playing a role comparable to that of Boas in North America. The institutionalization of French ethnology continued between the wars with the 1925 founding of the Institut d'Ethnologie by a philosopher Levi Brunhol, a sociologist Mauss, and an ethnographer or physical anthropologist Paul Rivet. The structuralist paradigm that took shape in the 1950s after Levi Strauss's return to France, linking his work in anthropology with that of Lacan in psychoanalysis and Barthes in literary studies. Currently, much of French anthropology is being carried out in regionally defined research teams, which now exist for most parts of the world. The field is also undergoing a process of Europeanization and internationalization, with increasing collaboration in the context of multilingual conferences and publications. The American tradition is the youngest of our four traditions, with a shorter history and more to report on for the 20th century. The American anthropologists come in at least four varieties: the subfields of cultural or social anthropology, today less often called ethnology, physical or biological anthropology, archaeology, and linguistic anthropology. With reference to the beginnings of American anthropology, its father was Franz Boas, who trained the major figures of the first half of the 20th century. With Boas came the anti-evolutionist critique, historicism of the trait distribution variety, and the institutionalization of anthropology in university departments, museums, and professional entities. The fact that American anthropology has included sociocultural anthropology, linguistics, physical anthropology, and archaeology, the so-called four fields approach, is partly a reflection of Boas's broad interests. Eventually, the anti-evolutionary position would dominate American anthropology until the 1940s, when an evolutionary approach would be reformulated in the work of Leslie White and Julian Stewart. Varying assessments of Tyler and his American contemporary, Lewis Henry Morgan, led mere fortes to suggest that Morgan gave birth to British social anthropology, while the very British Tyler fathered American cultural anthropology. A particular concern of American anthropology has been the study of complex societies. The term complex societies has long been used in anthropology to refer to state-organized systems, including those of pre-modern times, those of the modern industrialized era, and those whose states stem from post-colonial or other recent political transformations. Because American anthropology began with and for a long time remained concentrated on the American Indians, our venturing out into new ethnographic terrain marked a definitive transition. Ethnicity studies blossomed in American anthropology in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a period that some have described as after Barth or AB. As we briefly saw the diversification of anthropology globally, it is clear that different scholars in different contexts emphasized on certain aspects more than others. Their emphasis and their focus thus became the defining characteristic of that tradition. In all, these four trends in anthropology continue to contribute heavily towards the postmodern understanding of the discipline, besides further encouraging and facilitating research elsewhere in the world. Thank you for watching the presentation.